Okay, so welcome. I'm Lulu, and this is the wellness session that we do every week here, giving you actionable strategies to feel fantastic in your recovery. What we're going to talk about today is self-compassion and how that relates to recovery. And it may seem like a little bit of a stretch if you haven't had much of a think about it, but I can promise you I'm gonna persuade you today about the benefits of cultivating self-compassion, practicing self-compassion. And to be 100% honest, I was a skeptic. I was a late comer to this idea. The first time I was ever exposed to the very idea of having self-compassion for myself, I was at a day-long meditation retreat in the California foothills, literally meditating like all day long, and practicing developing kindness I thought it was just going to be for like other people. I was cool with that. And then the teacher said, oh, now we're going to send these loving wishes toward ourselves. And I dropped my jaw. I was gobsmacked. I thought it was the most audacious thing I had ever heard, that I would spend time wishing myself well. It just seemed like a waste of time to me. I didn't think I walked around like actively hating myself. It just really seemed like a waste of time. Didn't seem like it was going to do any good, and that I should really be focused more on trying to develop that good intention toward others. And so I've had a real journey with this particular kind of practice in my recovery, and I've come around to it. We don't hate ourselves into making positive changes. Whether for you that positive change you need to make is putting the bottle down, or deleting the gambling apps from your phone, or maybe it's something that seems littler. You're working on some littler thing, some habit of the mind that is painful for you. Well, that self-judgment, that self-criticism, that telling ourselves how crap we are at it is not what's going to help us make those changes. Self-compassion is part of what helps us make those changes. There's a Buddhist teacher named Frank Ostoseki. He says, the habit of constant self-judgment diminishes our life force, steals our inner peace, and crushes our souls. And that is what self-compassion helps counterbalance, that constant habit of self-judgment. So, as I said, I'm Lulu Koch. I'm a counselor, a dietitian, a cookbook author, and I've been in different recovery rooms for over 20 years now. Really, really love the recovery community. And that's why I'm here each week to bring you actionable strategies to support your physical and mental health in recovery. This is not medical advice. It's really general. If you're curious to know how I work one-on-one with clients, or want that additional support for whatever your challenges are, reach out to me. Let's have a chat and see if and how we might work together, or what other resources I might have for you. So you can pop me a note here, go to my Facebook page, Gut Feeling Nutrition Coaching. My website also has a contact me form, and lots of good resources there. So that's also Gut Feeling Nutrition Coaching. And just in time for today, I'm real happy to tell you, I just got the mindfulness class that we did a while ago here, the myths of mindfulness. I just got that video posted on the Facebook page, Gut Feeling Nutrition Therapy, and you're going to see as we go along today that there's a link between mindfulness and self-compassion. So I wanted to be sure to get that resource to you in case you missed it the first time around, or just want to refresh on it now. Okay. So that's all the good stuff. We're recording this part, so I'll save the questions in the little comment box until the end there. But if you have chats as we go along, if you want to just pop me a note in the chat, I do try to pick those up. Let's go. Let's talk about self-compassion, because the courage that is called upon for us to look honestly and compassionately at ourselves is huge. Some of us may even think that the courageous part is just looking at ourselves and our actions, and that the compassion doesn't really take any extra courage. And I disagree with that. It's pretty easy to beat ourselves up. But anybody who's been involved in 12-step program and has done a 4th step, a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves, and sharing that with another person, we know it takes courage to look. Shauna Shapiro says that the willingness to face the darker parts of ourselves and the darker parts of life takes courage. She wrote this beautiful book on mindfulness called Good Morning, I Love You. So the willingness to face the darker parts of ourselves takes real courage. And oftentimes we don't want to. We don't want to go there. Our typical coping mechanisms toward the aspects of ourselves we're less comfortable with going to be more like shame and rationalization. If you're anything like me, those would be my default tendencies. Shame, this bubbling, squelchy, swampy sense that there's something wrong with me, just deep in my core. A deep-rooted certainty that I'm bad, it's all my fault. That just percolates around as a foundation when I reflect on some of the things I've done wrong, or mistakes that I've made, places I have regret from certainly before my recovery, but also within that recovery. So shame is just right there. And that's part of how our brain is wired. Our amygdala, the memory portion of our brain, the part of our brain that helps create and hold on to memories, helps make decisions, and helps drive emotional responses, the amygdala triggers off a hormonal surge of norepinephrine and cortisol when we start to think about those things that feel shameful. It increases our stress and it narrows our perspective. We scan exclusively for threats then when our brain is under this activation of shame. It inhibits our ability to think creatively and flexibly. We can't learn when we're in the grip of that shame. We can't change behaviors or do something a new way when we're in the grip of that shame. And yet it's so uncomfortable and sticky. We just keep closing the door on it and it keeps growing right there. Yeah, does that sound familiar? So that's one of the ways that we tend to default to addressing our mistakes or regrets. And then the other one might be rationalization and denial. It's not my fault. I'm just not going to think about it. I don't want to look at that. I'm putting it in the too hard basket. It could even take the form, this rationalization could take the form of pep talks and positive affirmations that are sort of plastering over the truth of our experience. Like, hey, I'm great just the way I am. And I'm going to go out and keep lying and cheating and using and doing things that don't feel esteemable. But I'm going to look myself in the mirror and say that pep talk or affirmation. And those words are empty if our heart isn't transformed and opened with a real sense of love and care and kindness for our struggles. So let's define our terms, because there's quite a few of them that seem all related. Compassion, empathy, sympathy, altruism. What exactly are we talking about here? There's some underlying sense with all of them that we're trying to understand probably somebody else's emotional pain and be a little bit kind toward it, maybe a little generous. Empathy is specifically that sense of experiencing somebody else's feelings. Based on our mirror neurons, the way there's an emotional contagion. And if I see that you're happy and smiling, I feel more relaxed. I feel happier and smiling. If I see you cry, I feel that impulse, that impact, and I might start to feel a little sad and teary myself. That's empathy, feeling another person's feelings. It's similar to sympathy. Sympathy comes from the roots of sim, meaning with, and pathos, meaning feeling, with feeling together is sympathy. And yet sympathy has this additional quality of being completely sucked in and enmeshed, just getting absolutely taken away by this feeling of feeling sorry for somebody else. So it's not really where we want to go. That kind of Hallmark card, getting sucked in emotionally, is not where we want to go with these qualities. Altruism seems like it might be related. These are taking actions that could benefit somebody else, but we might not have any, there might not be any real sense of empathy or compassion involved in altruism at all. I could make a donation that I just wanted the tax write-off for, and I just really don't even care about the charity that I donate to. So altruism doesn't have to have this emotional component of care at all. Compassion does. Compassion means that we see and acknowledge the suffering, and we want to take action to reduce the suffering. It includes empathy. It includes altruism. It's this emotional response to a perception of suffering, including a real desire to help. And this is part of what makes compassion such a strong quality. It's not just, oh, self-compassion, I feel so sorry for myself. Like, it's this commitment to take action to reduce it. It's not the same as self-esteem. In fact, the research shows that self-compassion has all the benefits of self-esteem without the drawbacks. Self-compassion does not involve social comparison, and self-esteem typically does. If I have self-esteem, it's because I've judged myself to be worthy as compared to others. It requires success to prove my own self-worth. Self-compassion means that we are worthy no matter what, and we know that. We know we are worthy no matter what, no matter anybody else. Kristen Neff, one of the leading researchers in this field, she wrote some very accessible books. She has some talks online, and I'll list her as a resource later. But she says, when we suffer, caring for ourselves as we would care for someone we truly love, that's self-compassion. It includes self-kindness, a sense of common humanity, and mindfulness. And these are qualities we cultivate in recovery. We know these qualities of common humanity and kindness and bringing awareness and mindfulness toward our experience. But when we think about self-compassion specifically, we might run into a few typical roadblocks, some ways of thinking about self-compassion that aren't helpful and don't support our recovery. There can be a real common perception that self-compassion will undermine our motivation. Like somehow it's motivating to be critical of ourselves. Many of us have a deep-rooted belief that that is true. And that if we're being compassionate and kind to ourselves, that's somehow going to sap any of our motivation. And actually what the research shows is that cultivating a mindset of self-kindness, self-compassion, it creates the optimal psychological and mental environment to encourage us to do our best. We could possibly see this if we think of a small child or a beloved animal. Scolding them and telling them how bad they are is not going to motivate them to do better. But being kind and saying, oh, I saw you really tried and you didn't quite get it right, but you really tried. I bet you could try again. That's going to make that child or, puppy really want to do better next time. And self-compassion has that same effect on us. We could have the idea that self-compassion is selfish, and that taking care of myself more means that I'm not attending to the people around me who I care about. And the analogy here is just that airplane mask analogy, right? We have to be taking care of ourselves in healthy ways before we're going to have something to share with others. Some of us might have had that experience in the rooms where we're giving and giving and giving and service and service and service, and we start to run so empty. And we're cranky and we're tired and we're hateful because we're not taking care of ourselves. We're so busy taking care of others. So it's not true that self-compassion is selfish. And in fact, what we see is that people who score higher on self-compassion scores are also more altruistic and more generous. They're more giving of time and energy because they're so filled up with this sense of kindness and love. It just bubbles over and we want to share it. We might think self-compassion is self-indulgent. Like if I'm kind to myself, I'm just going to lay around and eat Tim Tams and binge watch TV shows forevermore. I'm never going to get anything done. It's super self-indulgent to just take care of myself. And, maybe there's a time and a place for that, but ultimately self-compassion means we care about ourselves so much that we want to take good care of ourselves. And a whole weekend of not moving off the couch and having nothing but Twinkies to eat, that's actually self-destructive. It's not self-kindness. And so we see that people who practice self-compassion have higher health behaviors, less smoking, more exercise. We're going to talk about drinking particularly, but other drugs of addiction. So people tend to have healthier behaviors when they have a real attitude of self-compassion. We might think self-compassion is going to eat away at our sense of responsibility and integrity. Like, oh, no big deal. I said I'd show up and help with the chairs. I don't have to. I'll just forgive myself. Again, that's not real self-compassion. Self-compassion creates a foundation of safety from which we get real with ourselves and take real responsibility and make some real hard changes, but from a place of kindness toward ourselves rather than beating ourselves up. And here's the big one. I hear this in so many different ways. Self-compassion is weak. It's sort of woo-woo, soft. It's not a hard and strong quality. And this could especially be the case. There's some research showing that men who feel more limited by typical masculine norms and feel like they really need to project a hard and strong image in the world, they might particularly have this idea that self-compassion is weak. And I think we can reject that out of hand. It takes a lot of courage and strength to be kind to ourselves. It is easy to beat ourselves up. The whole world teaches us to do that. And for many of us coming out of our addictions, we were our own number one critics. But it may be that our families were critical. It may be that the judge was critical, the social workers. We got a lot of messages telling us how flawed and bad we were. And it's easy to go along with that. It takes a real act of courage and commitment to practice kindness to ourselves no matter what, and no matter what we did or didn't do when we were really in the throes of our unskillful behavior. And again, the research backs this up. We see that having more self-compassion leads to greater strength and resilience in the face of trauma. And this has been done in studies with war veterans who were engaged in active combat in Afghanistan, for example. Nobody is saying these are like woo-woo people who are not strong, and yet we see that they're more resilient if they can acknowledge their fear and anxiety with an attitude of kindness. It reduces the levels of PTSD that the soldiers might experience if they have higher scores in self-compassion. So it's a really strong, courageous quality here. And yet we're not all given the same access to it. We see early childhood experiences really inform the ease with which we might feel self-compassion. And for those of us in the rooms, it's good to know that the science is showing a really direct pathway from early childhood abuse of different kinds or neglect of different kinds toward low rates of self-compassion, low ability to emotionally regulate, and then this leading to later addiction problems. Like there's a clear continuum there that impacts so many of us who have had that history of addiction and addictive behaviors. That's based on a lack of secure attachment as children, where our caregivers weren't able to provide a safe and secure and kind and loving foundation for us. It's based on parental direct criticism and conflict in the home. That impairs our ability to be self-compassionate with ease. And certainly any kind of overt abuse, physical emotional sexual abuse. Any of these are linked with emotional dysregulation, low self-compassion, and later addiction risk. So when we can begin to cultivate self-compassion, even with those really horrific childhood histories some of us may have, we begin to reduce the self-criticism. And interestingly, a lack of self-compassion means that we experience more mental fatigue when we're trying to exert willpower. So if we're trying to stay clean and sober today, or we're trying not to continue a behavior of addiction, we want all the willpower possible. We don't want to be mentally fatigued in terms of making those choices. And cultivating self-compassion will help us have less mental fatigue, more ability to keep recommitting to those changes. So we see that along with addiction treatment, that self-compassion can be part of trauma therapy as well. And of course, those are also linked. Let's talk for a moment about the neurophysiological basis of self-compassion, like what's going on in the brain and the body with self-criticism and self-compassion, kind of looking at those almost as opposites. So self-criticism triggers the threat defense system in our brain. Our cortisol starts pumping, our adrenaline starts pumping, and we are scanning for threat. And as I mentioned earlier, our ability to absorb new information, to learn, to make changes, all of that is flattened when we're in the middle of this self-criticism, because our brain experiences that self-criticism as an attack. It doesn't matter that the attack is being generated by ourselves, that our psyche experiences that self-criticism as, I'm under attack, I need to defend myself against this. So anything new, anything fresh, anything kind is out of the way. When we cultivate more self-compassion, then our caregiving systems of the brain get activated. We experience more oxytocin, which is a hormone linked with feelings of safety, connection, care, reduced distress, support. And I don't know about you, but when I'm feeling safe and cared for and supported, I'm able to make better choices. Yeah? So we see that connection with addiction. Possibly also some endogenous opiates coming on board with practicing self-compassion, so that would reduce our perception of pain. So there's three aspects of self-compassion when you look at how it's been studied. Three different aspects we're looking at: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So I'll take them maybe in opposite direction. The mindfulness aspect of self-compassion means that we're staying aware of what's going on and we're not getting carried away by reactivity, emotional reactivity. We're able to be with things as they are without getting swept away with them. It's maybe the difference between being sucked into active addiction versus being firmly in our first step, where we're seeing, we have that space and distance to admit our powerlessness, admit our addiction, admit that we're in psychological pain or emotional pain, but we have that little bit of distance instead of being sucked away into it. That's the mindfulness. It's avoiding the extremes of running away from difficult emotions versus getting sucked away in them. We have that middle ground, a little more balance. Common humanity is another characteristic of self-compassion. And that's different for those of us who might have a case of that terminal uniqueness. We come in, we're so battered, we feel so lonely. I feel isolated, I feel alone, nobody understands me. Surely I'm the worst person ever because of XYZ that happened when I was in my disease. So we feel so alone. And part of the journey of self-compassion, even though it seems like self-compassion would be pointed just right here, oh no, part of the journey of it is to see that actually we're all connected. My own experience is part of this larger whole. It's not abnormal. So this would be akin to our fifth step, right? Those of us who are in a 12-step kind of background might have done a fifth step where we sit down and we share with another human being, maybe with our sponsor, the things that feel secret and shameful and awful and unique about us. And maybe we get greeted with, yeah, me too. And the shame lifts. We're not so alone anymore. This is part of the power of self-compassion. And then self-kindness instead of self-judgment. We're learning to treat ourselves kindly, actively comforting ourselves. How could we support ourselves as we would a friend? So those are the three aspects of self-compassion as it's outlined in the research. And a reminder to everyone, of course, when I comment on the research in these programs, I have it available. If you want to see any of the studies I mentioned, pop me a note. Happy to do it. So now that we've laid that groundwork, set out our definitions, I am going to try to sell you on cultivating self-compassion on purpose. As I said, coming out of some of the sort of backgrounds and traumas many of us have, it might not be our natural default position to be kind and gentle to ourselves. We might have to really try to cultivate it on purpose. I'm going to try to talk you into it by sharing with you some of the research-backed benefits to self-compassion. We know people who have higher rates of self-compassion have decreased negativity, decreased anxiety, decreased depression, stress, perfectionism, self-blame. All of those are lower for people who score higher in self-compassion. And likewise, higher rates of life satisfaction, happiness, connectedness, self-confidence, optimism, curiosity, gratitude. Wow, what a basket of goodness. Those have all been studied separately. Who doesn't want that? That's what we got into recovery for, right? To be able to feel happy and connected and confident and grateful. Our coping and resilience capacity goes up because even in recovery, things are going to happen and we're going to need resilience. We are experiencing that on a global level right now. The stress that just happens in life and the need to be resilient and cope with difficulties. We will be more able to do that with more self-compassion to draw on, including coping better with chronic health conditions. Our motivation is enhanced. We have more desire to learn and to grow. Our personal standards remain just as high as people who score higher in self-criticism. So the personal standards are just as high. But the difference is when we don't quite meet them, we're not going to be as upset about it. We're just going to roll up our sleeves and go out and try it again. Like keep coming back, right? Less fear of failure with more self-compassion and more likelihood to keep persisting in the face of failures. And let's face it, we are all going to have failures, whether it's sending out your 200th job application to crickets, whether it's failing out of your first university course that you signed up for as a grown-up, going back to school, or even just a little thing like putting salt in the cookies and having a real instead of sugar and failing at the chocolate chip cookie test. Like we're all going to fail. We need tools that help us persist and keep going and keep trying. And self-compassion is a powerful tool for that. What else? What other goodness is there? I'm looking at my list here. Oh, health. Well, this is right up my alley. Higher rates of self-compassion, which we might think of as being an emotional or psychological quality, directly correlated with positive physical health behaviors. So people who score higher on self-compassion skills exercise more, they practice safer sex, they are more likely to quit smoking, they have less alcohol use, that's in a general population, not a recovery population per se, and they visit the doctor more often for routine health care. They will demonstrate healthier body image, healthier eating, less preoccupation and obsession with body shape and size, but more actual behaviors to ensure having a healthy body. Less likely to binge after blowing a diet. I'm putting that in quote marks. I have a lot of opinions about diets, but less likely to binge just because they did have one of the chocolate chip cookies. Fewer worries about weight, not so much disordered eating, more intuitive eating. So less of that tight mental obsession on certain outcomes, shape, size, weight, and more actual persistence of doing the things that will ensure physical health. How good is that? Now let's look directly at the role of self-compassion and addictive substances and behaviors. It works back and forth in a few different ways. So I was pretty delighted to see how much research there is out there on this topic. So important. Overall, we can see that having higher scores of self-compassion reduces alcohol and drug use. In one study, it reduced the amount of drinking that people reported as a means to cope with anxiety. It reduced the amount of marijuana being smoked in order to cope. And then on the flip side, we see that lower rates of self-compassion suggest a higher risk of substance use disorders, and raising self-compassion then may be a useful addition to substance use disorder treatment and prevention. We see this with internet addiction. Higher rates of self-compassion lead to a reduced risk of internet addiction. And I believe that study encompassed a few different behaviors. So it might have been kind of gaming type addictions and social media type addictions. I don't think that it included online porn or gambling. So self-compassion is variably related with sex addiction. It depends on the study. This is an area that has less research around it, but self-compassion rates in general may be lower in sex addicts than substance addicts. One study of it was 160 men, of whom 67 were in Sex Addicts Anonymous. 48 of the men were in Narcotics Anonymous, and they had 45 members of the general population. So it was a direct comparison of people whose primary 12-step affiliation was sex addicts versus Narcotics Anonymous. And what they found was that there was lower levels of sex addiction or lower levels of self-compassion in the sex addiction group. But then other studies have not found that. And of course, we also know there's so many of us experience multiple addictions. So it might be, I don't know how well they parsed apart whether these were truly like only sex addicts and only drug addicts versus people who might have been somewhere on that whole spectrum of the process of addiction. Overall, though, we see that increased self-compassion is linked with increased self-control in recovering addicts. And so if you could imagine to your early days, maybe you're in early days right now, maybe it's been a while, maybe you could think of somebody you know who has been in early recovery. It's really useful to have more self-control at that time and not be so likely to jump into whims, right? So one easy way to get more self-control is to cultivate self-compassion. This is a fun one. I'm going to share this one just because I think it's fun. The study itself actually wasn't that well designed, but it was a study directly asking about what is the role of self-compassion in chocolate addiction. So some of us can put our hands in the air and just admit, hi, I'm Lulu, I'm a chocolate addict, and that's not likely to change. I'm not quite ready to change yet. But if I was, self-compassion would be potentially useful. This study looked at 28 different studies of addiction and self-compassion, as well as having its own study sample of 50 people. They hypothesized that we are driven to excessively consume chocolate in order to regulate our magnesium levels, our serotonin and dopamine, neurotransmitter levels, our hormones. And for some people that gets out of hand and we become chocolate addicts. So if that, for the people in this study who were identified as chocolate addicts according according to the researchers, they had a lower level of self-compassion. And the hypothesis was that people with more self-compassion want to be healthy and happy for the long term out of that sense of care for themselves. So they're less likely to engage in potentially harmful behavior, such as excessive chocolate consumption. The researchers wrote, people who do not manifest self-compassion on an inner level try to find themselves in external elements and use chocolate in order to provide the help, care, and understanding that they need. So I'm poking a little bit of fun at this one, but I think we could take that, chocolate addiction, and we could apply that to any of our addictions. That sentence, if we're not able to fill our own needs for kindness and connection internally, we may find ourselves looking to external sources and substances to try to create a sense of care. And for many of us, that's led to a lot of damaging behaviors. So the good news is, even without trying hard or purposefully seeking to cultivate self-compassion, simply staying clean and sober may increase self-compassion naturally for those who already have at least an alcohol problem. People in one 15-week study in early treatment found that the people at the beginning of treatment had much higher depression, anxiety, stress scores, high alcohol use scores. Of course, they were commencing alcohol treatment, so high alcohol use scores and low self-compassion. And at the end of 15 weeks, that wasn't purposely trying to teach self-compassion in this treatment center, but at the end of that 15 weeks of treatment and really committing to staying clean and sober, the participants had reported a significant increase in self-compassion, common humanity, mindfulness, and self-kindness, and much lower scores for self-judgment, isolation. Right? So that sounds like good stuff. Now, this study I'm excited to share with you. I was blown away to find it. It is a direct study of the roles of shame and self-compassion in Alcoholics Anonymous members. So this was 148 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. 32% of them had been sober for more than 10 years in program. 16% of them were less than a year sober in AA. And everybody else kind of in between. And what they found was that, for one, just staying sober for a long time increases self-compassion and decreases shame. And hey, that makes so much sense, doesn't it? If I'm looking back at what I did yesterday and I did not steal somebody's money to go buy some alcohol and then get in a car crash, if I did not do that yesterday, and in fact I haven't done it for 10 years, perhaps it's easier to not feel shame and to have self-compassion. So just time helped. But if you don't have much time up yet, do not fret. Do not fear. There are other ways to use the programs of the tools of the program to help increase your sense of self-compassion and reduce shame. So level of engagement with the program is effective regardless of time. And my guess is this would be the same for non-12-step related programs like Buddhist Recovery Network or LifeRing, other programs as well. But this particular study was just on AA. And so the activities that were most predictive of increased self-compassion and reduced shame were being engaged in sober social activities outside of meetings. So like the fellowship before the fellowship, that kind of thing. Working with sponsees or sponsors. Speaking at meetings. I thought that was interesting. Like they studied, is it prayer and meditation? Is it being involved in service structures? What are the features of program involvement that have this powerful positive impact? So sober social activities outside of the meetings, being engaged in sponsorship, and speaking up at meetings were all helpful, as well as completing a 5th step and completing a 9th step. So of all of the different steps that they looked at, those were the most profound for lifting our sense of shame, telling somebody else what we've done and then cleaning up the mess in our 5th step and 9th step. and increasing our sense of self-compassion. So I just thought that was a really cool study. I was super excited to share that with you guys. More positive benefits of self-compassion. It's better relationships. Cultivating self-compassion for ourselves helps heal our early attachment wounds and emotional dysregulation so that we can go on to have healthier relationships with others that will help us continue to have personal accountability. For one thing, we become more conscientious, we take greater responsibility for our past mistakes, and we're more likely to apologize and make amends for what we may have done wrong. And as caregivers, certainly those of us in the rooms, those of us involved in caregiving for family members or professionally, having more self-compassion reduces burnout. It reduces compassion fatigue. We have more satisfaction with that caregiving role. And we just experience increased well-being. For instance, parents of disabled children, it's so tough, so hard, but being able to be kind to ourselves if that's our situation, it makes it easier to keep going. We have better romantic relationships. That's evidence-based. That's in the literature. More caring and supportive relationships with less control dynamics and less verbal aggression. More forgiveness. Nelson Mandela said, "Our human compassion binds us, the one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future." So how do we do it? How do we increase self-compassion if that's not our default mindset? We can deliberately practice them and be aware. It's we'll actually do a little short self-compassion practice here in a few minutes, but be aware that if you do decide to deeply engage with self-compassion, it can actually provoke some discomfort. We can find that old emotional wounds get stirred up when we turn toward ourselves with kindness. It's like we open the doors of our heart with self-compassion. Fresh air comes in and any smoldering fires can just erupt. Kristen Neff calls that backdraft. She says, most of our hearts are hot with the pain accumulated over a lifetime. In order to function, we needed to shut out our stressful or painful experiences. When the door of our heart opens and kindness flows in, old hurts are likely to come out. The discomfort we feel is not being created by self-compassion practices. It's simply being re-experienced and transformed by the power of compassion. So we need to be aware that this can happen and have those tools available to support ourselves. We could have physical discomfort, mental thoughts, oh, I'm all alone, I'm not doing this right, or emotions like shame and grief could come up. So what do we do if that's the case? Well, we check right in the instant, what do I need to do to feel safe right now? Comfort and soothe ourselves, hot bath, call a friend, music. We might allow some of those uncomfortable feelings to be present without reacting to them. Many of them will dissipate. We can use some mindfulness, labeling the emotions without getting wrapped up in them. There's grief. There's fear. Or we could just decide to back off a little bit and engage in ordinary activities. What do I see and hear in this moment? Could I wash the dishes or go for a walk? Move my body, sensing into this moment rather than doing that deep emotional dive. If you find yourself getting really activated around these kinds of practices, it might be a great time to reach out to a counselor, a sponsor who's trauma sensitive, or even call a helpline. So some of the fundamental qualities that we're bringing to mind in our self-compassion practice are awareness that this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of living and I am not alone. May I be kind to myself. Yeah. So we're going to do just a short practice right now. If you'd care to join me, you don't have to. You could just go get a cup of tea if that felt like the right thing for you to do right now. It's just going to be a couple of moments of reflection. And if you're keen to do that with me, I invite you to just close your eyes and take a couple of breaths into your belly, into your body. just call to mind a particular experience you're having right now, some little difficulty you're facing. Not the biggest thing in the world, some little difficulty that you're facing right now that feels challenging. A missed deadline at work, or a little struggle with one of your kids. And notice how it feels when you bring it to mind. What physical sensations come up for you when you reflect on this difficulty? What emotions come up when you think of this little difficulty? Just noticing if maybe there's sadness or tightness, whatever it may be. Now try to come up with a kind statement you could make to yourself about this challenge. You could even pretend it was your friend's challenge and think of a kind statement you might offer your friend. Something like, "Oh, you're really worried about this. I'm here for you." Or, "It's really hard. We can get through this." What would be a kind statement you could offer yourself about the challenge? It's okay to make mistakes. I'm learning. You could even put your hand on your heart as you reflect on that statement. Feel that warm, soothing touch of your own hand on your skin. And then inviting that sense of awareness with the rest of the world. It is totally normal to go through hard times. It's the most natural thing in the world to feel scared and stressed. Everybody feels scared and stressed sometimes. So many other people in the world might be feeling exactly this way in this moment. And so we might have an intention to send a wish of kindness to all the other people struggling in a similar way. May everybody else who's worried about the same thing feel some ease, feel some comfort in the midst of their worries. And then we might wish the same thing for ourselves. In the midst of these worries, may I too feel comfort and ease. I'm sending compassion to myself and all others in this situation. I'm just taking a couple more big breaths, releasing all that thinking and enjoying a fresh, deep breath. Thank you so much for sharing this really special topic with me. I hope you feel good and regulated if you chose to do the practice. And if not, please send me a note, reach out. I want to share a few resources. There's the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. Really lovely exercises and practices. There's the book I mentioned, Good Morning, I Love You, by Shauna Shapiro. Really nice. I read mine at night, actually. I find it really soothing, uplifting, lovely bedtime reading, even though the title is Good Morning, I Love You. There's compassion meditations available online, and if you'd like the link to some of those, you can pop me a note. let's take a kind perspective on ourselves and our recovery. Supporting our recovery with self-compassion makes so much sense. Not only are we going to be more likely to be successful with recovery, we're just going to feel happier and healthier and higher energy while we do it. This is such a great strategy to meet the world from an empowered and positive frame, even if sometimes it feels really difficult. So if you have follow-up questions, wonder how you could apply some of this to yourself if it feels impossible, or if you're worried about some of the real difficult stuff that could arise, please send me a note. Touch base with me, Lulu at gutfeelingcoaching.com, or right here. And also welcome to check out my Facebook, Gut Feeling Nutrition Therapy, where I just posted the Myths of Mindfulness session we did here a while ago. So that video is up and could be a nice tandem video to think about in connection as well with the mindfulness aspect of self-compassion. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. It is such an honor and privilege to be here in the rooms with you.